The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before him. Miles of red sand, dry wind, and forgotten trails. To most people, it looked like an empty wasteland. But to John Carter, a former cavalry scout who had spent half his life on horseback under the sun, it looked like peace. After leaving the army, John didn't know where he belonged. He had fought hard, lost good men, and seen things that stayed in his mind long after the battles ended. The noise of cities made him restless, and the silence of the desert seemed to welcome him. He wanted to live where no orders were shouted, no guns echoed, and no one told him who the enemy was. That's why he bought a forgotten piece of desert land for 12 cents an acre, a deal so strange that even the clerk at the county office had laughed. "It's cursed land," the man had said, handing him the papers. "Nothing grows there except bones." John had just smiled. "Then it's perfect," he replied. He built a small wooden shack with his own hands, not far from an old dried-up well. The boards creaked, the roof leaked, and dust covered everything, but to him it felt like freedom. Each morning, he walked the dry plains, studying the shapes of rocks, the sound of wind through the canyons, and the patterns of hawks circling above. Sometimes he thought the desert was speaking, whispering stories too old for men to remember. Days passed slowly. John fixed fences, collected firewood, and wrote letters he never sent. He was trying to make peace with the ghosts in his heart. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, the air changed. A cold wind swept across the land, and with it came a faint sound, soft, broken, like a cry carried through the sand. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then he heard it again, a voice small and frightened. John grabbed his lantern and rifle, following the sound toward the old well. The orange glow of the lantern flickered against the rocks as he searched the shadows. Then he saw her, a young girl half hidden behind a fallen log, trembling with fear. Her clothes were torn and covered in dust, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears. She couldn't have been more than 16. When John knelt down, she backed away, clutching a small leather pouch to her chest. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." The girl didn't answer. She just shook her head and whispered something in a language he didn't understand. Apache. John recognized the words, though not their meaning. He had spent years near Apache lands and knew enough to see that she wasn't just lost, she was running. He gently poured water from his canteen into a tin cup and handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it with shaking hands. After she drank, she tried to stand, but her leg gave out. John saw a deep cut on her shoulder, dried blood marking the wound. He tore a strip of cloth from his sleeve and wrapped it carefully. "Name?" he asked, pointing to himself. "John." Then he pointed at her. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Ayanna." It was a beautiful name, soft like the wind through the grass. John led her back to his shack and lit a fire. She sat silently by the flames, holding the leather pouch close as if it were part of her soul. Every now and then she glanced toward the window, eyes full of worry. That night, John heard something again, the distant echo of horses. He stepped outside and saw flickers of light far away, lanterns moving slowly through the desert. They weren't riders just passing through. They were searching. When he returned inside, Ayanna's face had gone pale. "They come," she whispered. John understood enough. Someone was hunting her. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The fear in her eyes said everything. He loaded his rifle, locked the door, and sat by the window, watching the horizon. Memories of his soldier days came back. Nights of waiting for unseen enemies, the weight of silence before danger. But this time it felt different. He wasn't fighting for orders or for medals. He was protecting someone who had no one else. When dawn came, the riders had moved farther north. For the moment, they were safe. Over the next few days, John and Ayanna slowly began to trust each other. She spoke little English, but through signs and gestures, she told him fragments of her story. Her family had lived in the desert for generations near the sacred canyons, but after a raid on their village, she was the only one who escaped. She carried something her people had hidden, something others wanted badly enough to kill for. She showed him the pouch one night as the firelight danced between them. Inside was a small carved stone wrapped in cloth, smooth, ancient, and marked with symbols. John didn't understand its meaning, but he felt its weight, not in his hand, but in the way she looked at it. "This, not gold," she said slowly, pressing her palm to her heart. Spirit family old, he nodded. And they want it? She looked toward the window again and whispered, Yes, they want what's buried. John didn't press for details. Whatever the secret was, it wasn't his to take. But something inside him stirred, that old sense of duty that never left a soldier's heart. He couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. Over the next few days, John kept a watchful eye on the desert. Sometimes he saw distant shapes on the horizon, men on horseback moving slowly, searching. He fixed the well, repaired the roof, and quietly set small traps near the trail. Every sound made him alert. One night, as the stars shimmered like cold fire above them, Ayanna sat by the door, humming a tune. It was a sad, ancient melody, one he couldn't understand, but it carried a feeling of longing and loss. He realized she wasn't just hiding. She was mourning. John remembered the faces of his old friends, men who never came back from battle. He realized that pain, the kind that never truly leaves, was something they both shared. The next morning, Ayanna helped him draw water from the well. When she looked down, her expression changed. She stared at the stones surrounding the well, running her fingers over one that had strange markings. Her lips moved, whispering words in Apache. Then she looked at John and said quietly, This place, not empty, sacred. He didn't fully understand, but something in her voice made him feel the land differently. Maybe that was why it had always felt alive, as if it had a memory of its own. As the sun set that evening, John stood outside, watching the orange light spread across the sand. He had come here to escape his past, but now he felt like the desert was pulling him into a new story, one older and deeper than his own. Behind him, Ayanna stirred the fire, her shadow flickering against the cabin walls. She was still clutching the leather pouch, still afraid, but somehow John could tell she trusted him now. Then, just as night fell, a single lantern flickered again in the distance. The riders had returned. John's jaw tightened. He checked his rifle, looked back at Ayanna, and said quietly, We'll be ready. The desert wind picked up again, carrying whispers through the sand. And somewhere in those whispers it sounded as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The night was quiet, but John could feel danger moving closer, like a storm behind the mountains. The flicker of lanterns far across the desert meant only one thing. The riders were back. He quietly stepped outside, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The air smelled of dust and smoke. He could hear faint echoes, the steady rhythm of hooves striking the sand. They were looking for something, or someone. Inside the small cabin, Ayanna sat near the fire, her eyes wide and filled with fear. She clutched the small leather pouch to her chest as if her life depended on it. John knelt beside her and said softly, We have to move before sunrise. She nodded but looked uncertain. She wasn't used to trusting strangers, yet something about John's calm voice made her believe him. He had already done more for her than anyone else would have. John packed a few things: a canteen of water, dried bread, a blanket, and his old rifle. Before leaving, he looked around the small cabin one last time. It wasn't much, but it had been home for a short while. Now it was just a memory waiting to be swallowed by the sand. They stepped out into the cool desert night. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the dunes. John led the way toward a narrow ravine that cut through the land like a scar. He knew every inch of this desert, every dry creek, every old trail. He had mapped it years ago when he rode with the cavalry. That knowledge was the only advantage they had. The ground was rough, but Ayanna followed without complaint. She was small but strong, moving like someone born of the land. Every now and then, she would stop and press her ear to the ground, listening. Her instincts were sharper than any compass. After several hours of walking, they reached a shallow canyon where shadows pooled between tall stone walls. John motioned for her to rest while he climbed a nearby ridge to look back. In the distance, faint glows moved across the sand. The riders had found their tracks. When he returned, Ayanna was humming softly, the same ancient tune she had sung by the fire days before. It sounded like a prayer. When she noticed him, she stopped and whispered, "They will not stop." "I know," he said quietly, "but we'll make sure they find nothing." As the first light of dawn began to color the sky, they continued deeper into the canyon. The land grew quieter, heavier, as if holding its breath. The wind carried a strange stillness, and Ayanna seemed to sense it too. "This place," she said softly, pointing ahead. "My people came here long ago. It is where the first sun rose." John listened with respect. He had seen many lands in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just rock and sand. It felt alive, like the earth was remembering something. They reached a cave hidden behind a curtain of dry vines and stones. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with sage. Ancient markings covered the walls, faded symbols drawn in red and brown. Ayanna touched one of them gently, whispering in her native tongue. "My grandfather told me," she said, "when the time comes, the land will protect its heart. This is that place." John finally understood. The sacred object she carried wasn't just a relic. It was a key to something older, something her people had buried to keep safe from greed and harm. The men who hunted her didn't understand that. They only wanted to dig up the past for money. Before they could rest, John heard the echo of horses again, this time, closer. He motioned for silence. The sound grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls. Dust rose on the horizon. They had been followed. John thought fast. "You stay here," he said. "Don't come out no matter what happens." Ayanna's eyes filled with worry. "They will hurt you." He smiled faintly. "I've been through worse." Then he stepped out into the open desert, his figure small against the vast emptiness. The riders appeared from the west, 4 men on horseback, faces hidden behind scarves, their coats whipping in the wind. They slowed when they saw him, unsure. John raised his hand calmly. "You're on private land," he called out. The leader dismounted. "We're looking for an Apache girl," he said, his tone cold. "She's a thief. She stole something valuable." John's jaw tightened. "There's no one here but me," he replied. The man's eyes narrowed. "We tracked her prints to this canyon." John looked out toward the dunes. "The desert plays tricks," he said. "Tracks vanish. Maybe you're following ghosts." The man stepped closer, studying him. "You used to be cavalry, didn't you? I can tell by the way you stand." John didn't answer. He just met the man's gaze until the rider looked away. The silence between them stretched thin, like a rope ready to snap. Finally, the leader gave a sharp whistle, and the men turned their horses away, pretending to leave. But John knew better. They would circle around, searching the canyon. He hurried back into the cave. Inside, Ayanna was waiting, her eyes full of fear, but also determination. "They are close," she whispered. He nodded. "Then we finish this now." She opened the leather pouch and took out the small carved stone. The markings on it glowed faintly in the dim light, almost like the desert itself was responding. She walked to a large flat rock at the back of the cave and placed the stone carefully in a hollow groove carved centuries ago. Then she knelt and began to whisper words in her native language. The air grew heavier, the ground trembling softly beneath their feet. Dust fell from the ceiling as a low hum filled the cave, a sound like the voice of the earth itself. Outside, the wind began to rise, swirling sand into the air. The riders, now dismounted, covered their faces and stumbled. The sky darkened and the desert seemed to come alive. The dunes shifting, the air vibrating with unseen energy. John helped Ayanna steady herself as the sound grew louder, then slowly faded. When the wind stopped, everything was silent again. They stepped outside. The riders were gone. No horses, no footprints, nothing. The desert had erased them completely, as if it had swallowed its own secret. Ayanna stood still, eyes closed, whispering a prayer of thanks. John looked around in disbelief. The land was calm again, golden light spilling over the dunes as the sun climbed higher. The danger had passed, but he knew something powerful had happened, something beyond his understanding. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Ayanna turned to him and said softly, "The land remembers those who protect it." John nodded slowly. And those who listened to it, he added. They walked back toward his cabin in silence. The desert that once felt empty now seemed full of life and meaning. He realized he had not only helped Ayanna, he had also found something he'd been missing all his life: peace. Days turned into weeks. John repaired the cabin, planted a few desert flowers near the well, and watched them grow against the odds. Ayanna stayed for a while, helping him gather water and teaching him words from her language. Sometimes they would sit outside at dusk, watching the colors of the sky change. One morning she told him it was time for her to return to her people. He didn't try to stop her. He simply nodded and handed her a small piece of carved wood, a token he had made from the old fence. "Something to remember this place," he said. She smiled and replied, "The desert remembers us both." Then she walked away, her figure slowly blending into the horizon until she disappeared among the dunes. Years later, travelers passing through that stretch of desert often told strange stories. They said sometimes at sunset, they saw two figures walking side by side, a tall man and a young Apache girl, their shadows stretching across the red sand. Some said it was a mirage, others said it was the desert's way of remembering those who respected it. But the old folks in the nearest town would simply smile and say, "That's John Carter and the girl he saved. They're still watching over the land that cost 12 cents but held a treasure no one could ever buy."